Alternative Protein Public Sector Playbook. Our speaker today may be a familiar face if you're one of the 2 million people who have seen his TED Talk, or you might have seen his writing in small publications like the Wall Street Journal and the USA Today. I am talking, of course, about Bruce Friedrich. Bruce is the co-founder and executive director of the Good Food Institute, a nonprofit that promotes innovative alternatives to industrially produced animal products. Bruce oversees GFI's global strategy. He's also a TED Fellow, a Y Combinator alum. He was named an American Food Hero in 2021 and is a very popular speaker on food innovation, so we're very lucky to have him speaking for us today. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Bruce.
Thank you. Hello. How's everybody doing? I'm impressed that you made it over here after lunch. Felt a little bit comatose after all of that food. There definitely is a sort of pre-COVID and a post-COVID EA conference in terms of quality of venue and quality of food and kind of quality of everything. We went from super scrapple to whatever the opposite of that is. And I will say that I, for one, appreciate the change. GFI, I think people know, or for those of you who don't know, we were founded about 7 years ago. I started working on it. It is explicitly founded as an EA organization. And from the inception of GFI, our global battle cry has been that governments should be funding plant-based and cultivated meat. So for the same reason governments fund other climate and global health solutions, government should be funding alternative proteins. And what I'm going to talk about today is lessons from the Alternative Protein Public Sector Playbook. In other words, some of the things that we have learned through our policy work on behalf of alternative proteins. So the first thing I will do is give a fairly brief introduction to alternative proteins. What is it that we mean when we talk about alternative proteins and why? And then I will offer 7 of the lessons that some of them intuitive, maybe some of them a little less intuitive, and then Eric and I will have a conversation for about 25 or 30 minutes. So why alternative proteins? Alternative proteins because per capita meat consumption, and this is oftentimes surprising to people who care about food and are thoughtful, but per capita meat consumption, even in the United States, the highest per capita meat consumption are 2021, 2020, and 2019 in that order. So we have been educating people about the harms of industrial animal agriculture. There has been peer review article after peer review article after peer review article indicating that the way that we raise meat today is horrible for the climate, it's horrible for biodiversity, it's bad for global health, and it is insanely cruel to animals. And yet, this is what has happened from 1960 to 2010, and it has continued to go up. And there have been 10 peer-reviewed studies about how much meat is going to be consumed in 2050, and they clock in at 61% to more meat by 2050 to more than 3 times as much meat by 2050 globally. So this chart just continues to go up and up and up, despite the fact that, again, as these studies indicate, per capita meat consumption is absolutely hideous for the climate, as well as biodiversity and global health, which I will chat a little bit more about in a minute. So what's the hypothesis for why, even in the United States, despite all of our effort, 2021, 2020, 2019 as the top 3 per capita meat consumption, and globally meat consumption expected to go up by at least 60% by 2050, our hypothesis is that it boils down to systems 1 and systems 2 thinking. So Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate in economics, he posits that all of our activities are governed by either systems 1 or systems 2 thinking. Systems 1 thinking he refers to as click-whir, and it is instinctual. Systems 2 thinking is rational. Food appears to be instinctual for the vast majority of people. So if you go out and have conversations with friends, loved ones, and just everybody, and ask them, do you believe that you should make choices that align with environmentalism, or do you believe that you should make choices that are good for animals? Pretty much everybody will say yes, but when they sit down to eat, the vast majority of people, we are biologically programmed, going back forever, essentially. Is it delicious? Will it, is it caloric? Will it sustain me? And for us, can we afford it is going to be part of the calculation. So how do we apply the Daniel Kahneman click-whir systems 1 thinking instinct, systems 2 thinking rationality? How do we apply that to the harms of industrial animal agriculture? At GFI, we think we have the solution. We think the solution is Ben & Jerry's vegan ice cream. Who likes Ben & Jerry's vegan ice cream? Wow, applause for Ben & Jerry's vegan ice cream. Don't usually get applause for ice cream, but it's worthy of applause. And what I will point out is that everybody in this room who raised their hand thought, wow, Ben & Jerry's is delicious. If you didn't know where to find it, or if it had been insanely expensive, you would have hesitated to raise your hand. But nobody here, everybody raised their hand. Nobody thought, too fatty, too much sugar. It was a click-whir, instinctual reaction. Ben & Jerry's, man, that is delicious. So how do we apply that to the harms of meat specifically? And we think alternative proteins is the solution. So alternative proteins bucket 1, we can make meat from plants. So up until Ethan Brown, the founder of Beyond Meat, and Pat Brown, the founder of Impossible Foods, frustratingly no relation, the Brown non-brothers, the idea of plant-based meat, of veggie burgers, veggie nuggets, et cetera, was let's take soy protein, which is essentially the waste product of soy oil, or let's take wheat protein, which is essentially the waste product of the bread and pasta industries. Let's cram that stuff together, and let's force vegetarians to eat it. That was what plant-based meat was. Ethan and Pat came along, and Josh Tetrick, who formed Hampton Creek, Now Eat Just, and what they said was, look, meat, dairy, eggs, it's made of lipids, aminos, minerals, water. And then there's also, in dairy products, there'll be lactose, so sugars. But meat, lipids, aminos, minerals, and water. Plants also have lipids, aminos, minerals, and water. And their brainstorm was, we can hire tissue engineers and meat scientists and chemical engineers and plant biologists, and we can figure out how to biomimic the precise meat experience. We can do it using plants. It will require a fraction of the land, cause a fraction of the direct climate impact, remove animals from the equation altogether. And because it's so much more efficient, it will actually cost less. That's the theory of plant-based meat. At GFI, we have become more and more convinced that a fair number of people are going to want to continue to eat meat. For those people, we have cultivated meat. This is basically taking tissue engineering technologies, cross-applying them to food, and growing from cells actual animal meat. So if you're going to grow plants in a greenhouse, you're going to take a seed or you're going to take a cutting. You bathe the seed or the cutting in nutrients. The seed or the cutting grows into a plant. Basically the exact same theory, but using animal cells. So if you want to grow a chicken to slaughter weight, and a chicken is the quickest animal at going from coming out of the shell or being born to going to slaughter, it's going to take you about 40 days. If you do that with cultivated meat, you can get the same process in 6 to 7 days. And this is what that looks like at scale. It's your friendly neighborhood meat brewery, essentially. And I will tell you, I'm going to spare you the slaughterhouse and the industrial farm photos, but just to say this is a pleasanter photo to look at than what happens for conventional meat. The hypothesis of alternative proteins is that this is the only food and ag solution to climate change that analogizes to renewable energy and electric vehicles. So with renewable energy, the goal is not to try to turn back time on this chart. What we know to be true is that globally, humanity is going to consume more and more and more energy, but we can make that energy renewable and slash the external costs of energy consumption. So very valuable to ride a bike and turn the lights off when you leave the room and other things that are going to conserve energy. But most of the growth in energy consumption is happening in developing economies. They're nowhere near even where the US is yet. As countries develop, they will consume more energy. So the goal of renewable energy is to make that less harmful to humanity. Same thing with vehicles. We are going to sell more and more and more vehicles. Great to walk, great to ride a bike, great to use public transportation. All of those endeavors and all of that work is critically important. But globally, we will sell more and more cars. So let's make those cars electric cars and eventually eliminate combustion engines. Exact same thing with plant-based and cultivated meat. 100% of the studies indicate 61% more meat to more than 3 times as much meat by 2050. We can make that meat from plants, we can cultivate that meat from cells, and we can slash the external costs. So that is alternative proteins in a nutshell. I'm going to quickly run through 7 lessons from GFI's policy work in particular on alternative proteins, and then Eric and I will chat about whatever Eric has on his iPad for us to chat about. Lesson 1, pursuing multiple vectors of influence and making our solution fit within the audience's existing frameworks. So we talk a lot at GFI about climate change. Climate change is obviously the #1 cause area for environmentalists. About 20% of direct emissions climate change is attributable to industrial animal agriculture, which is about 70% more than all transportation combined. So it's about 70% more than all of the cars, all of the air travel, all of the trucks combined. And industrial animal agriculture is about 70% more. Just getting to 10% alternative proteins would decrease about a gigaton of emissions on an annual basis. That would be the same as eliminating emissions from the airline industry altogether. And it's actually quite a bit more, it's actually quite a bit bigger than that. If you're looking at something like renewable energy, it takes about 10 times as much land per unit of energy. 2 days ago, the New York Times had a story about how they're literally chopping down forests to put solar farms in an area of Alabama. Takes 10 times as much land. With alternative proteins, relative to beef, it takes 1/20 of the land. Relative to chicken, it takes 1/4 of the land. So this study in Nature Sustainability from last year by NYU environmental scientists says that if we shifted the 3 billion hectares of land that is right now growing crops to feed them to animals or grazing ruminants, if we shifted that, you don't even have to plant trees on it, like just let it rewild, we could sequester 26 gigatons of carbon every single year, which is about 50% of humanity's total emissions from this shift. So there's sort of a double positive whammy from a climate standpoint. We also have an incredibly powerful story to tell in the global health realm. And if anybody in here is involved in global health, I would be delighted to have a conversation with you about how incredibly valuable it would be for you to use some of your global health influence as a thought leader in this issue. In a nutshell, 2 massive global health advantages to alternative proteins. The first is based in the observation that about 70% of medically relevant antibiotics produced globally by the pharmaceutical industry are fed to farm animals. 70% of medically relevant antibiotics are fed to farm animals. The UK government says the threat to the human race from antimicrobial resistance is more certain than the threat from climate change. The former head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Margaret Chan, says we're literally ushering in the end of modern medicine if antibiotics stop working. So you want to scare, Google the end of working antibiotics. You want to ramp that scare up, add the word China to that Google search. We are not going to ban the use of antimicrobials anywhere other than maybe Europe, but we're not going to ban them in China. We're not going to ban them in Brazil. We're not going to ban them in the United States. It is a huge and existential global health risk. And then we're all I guess we're not really, but Joe Biden says we're at the end of, that COVID is in the rear view mirror as a pandemic. Maybe, maybe not. But COVID sent about 120 million people into extreme poverty, inconvenienced everybody in this room, made destitute more than 100 million people, and set back the elimination of poverty by probably a decade. The UN Environment Program and the International Livestock Research Institute released this report in July of 2020. As you can see, they're listing the 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic. The first one is increased industrial animal agriculture. Every single one of the tens of billions of animals who are living on farms right now, every single one of them is a potential vector for COVID 2023 or COVID 2027. So one is increased demand for animal protein. Two is industrial treatment of animals. And they flagged two things in this report. The first is that we're basically using genetic clone animals. Chickens, pigs, turkeys are more and more, even in developing economies, just one or two strains of animal, which depresses their immune system. And then you cram 50,000 chickens into a shed, and that depresses their immune system further. Seventh here is climate change. Fourth is unsustainable utilization of natural resources. So multiple of these are also contributors, but the first two are literally meat production as most likely causes of the next pandemic. And the thing to underline about climate change, antibiotic resistance, pandemic risk, biodiversity loss, food insecurity, the thing to underline about these is that they hit the global south the hardest and the worst. So all of these things are bad for us. All of these things are life and death for hundreds of millions of people in developing economies. And then the last thing, animal protection. I mean, even just in the United States, we slaughter about 9 billion land animals and even more sea animals every single year. Their lives are categorized by unmitigated misery. Chickens now grow about 7 times as quickly as they would naturally. An article in Poultry Science from the University of Arkansas said that if a human baby grew as quickly as a modern broiler chicken, she would weigh more than 200 pounds by the time she was 2 months old. Every single one of these animals is living in unmitigated misery. And yet, I lost a slide. How fascinating. And yet what we're expecting to see happen is more and more and more meat unless alternative proteins are successful. And then the thing that we're really leaning on overwhelmingly now, especially with Republicans, but also with folks who care about climate, is the degree to which alternative proteins can be a jobs and economic driver. So this report, the Global Innovation Needs Assessment, came out last November. It was produced by ClimateWorks Foundation and the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. It says we will produce that alternative proteins with sufficient government support globally can create 9.8 million new jobs by 2050, gross value add to the global economy of $1.1 trillion, climate benefits of $5.5 trillion. So in our meetings with Republicans, this is what we are totally leaning into. But this is also a huge one for Democrats, and we're specifically noting that on something like electric vehicles or renewable energy, the United States was the pioneer in solar, and now we produce 1% of our solar panels. The United States in the 90s was the pioneer in electric vehicles, and now we have 4 gigafactories for electric vehicles. China has 95, Europe has 10. This could be the future electric vehicles and solar panel production. Do we want those 9.8 million jobs and that $1.1 trillion in gross value add in the US? Or do we want those jobs and that economic activity in the countries that prioritize those industries? And that's bipartisan. We have a report that we put together with the Breakthrough Institute called the American Competitiveness and Alternative Proteins or something like that. If you Google GFI and American Competitiveness, it'll pop right up. And I think we quote Sonny Perdue, Donald Trump's Secretary of Agriculture, like 19 times in that report, just for good measure. Not really, I'm exaggerating. But it is leaning into the idea that it's jobs and economic activity are bipartisan. The second lesson, and I promise the further lessons will all be shorter. The second lesson is all politics are local, so think region first. GFI's global battle cry. So GFI is 6 organizations. We have GFI in the US, and then we have GFI India, Israel, Brazil, Asia Pacific out of Singapore, and Europe out of both Brussels and London. The plurality of GFI's team members are scientists. We have about 170 full-time staff. The plurality are scientists. But our global battle cry and the budget number that is the largest because we hire consultants and lobbyists is in policy. And our global battle cry is that governments should fund alternative proteins for the same reason they fund other issues having to do with global health, climate, and biodiversity. The 2 things that we focus on are 1, governments should fund open access science and that UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, it says $4.4 billion is what we should be shooting for. So it is, GFI just basically took their work and made it our goal. $4.4 billion for R&D and $5.7 billion for private sector incentives. So that's 2 and 3 here, incentivizing private sector R&D and supporting plant-based and cultivated meat infrastructure and manufacturing. That's our goal. And depending on where we're operating, we have we go about having that conversation in different ways. So Israel is referred to as the startup nation, and it is indeed the startup nation. That's why it's referred to that way. Has world-class scientists, tremendous entrepreneurship, innovation way above its weight. Of the first 8 cultivated meat companies that existed at the end of 2016, 3 of them were in tiny little Israel. And here is GFI's managing director for Israel serving cultivated meat to Benjamin Netanyahu, the first head of government to consume cultivated meat. Isaac Herzog, the president of Israel, was also the first head of state to consume cultivated meat. So really leaning in with Israel to tech innovation and to food security, which is a critical goal for the state of Israel because it is so tiny. Alternative proteins are so efficient. Those are the 2 things we talk about in Israel. In Brazil, where we are also extraordinarily successful, we are leaning into the idea of Brazil's role as the world's meat supplier. As I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, we work with JBS, BRF, and Marfrig, which are the 1st and 5th largest meat companies in the world, and the 3 largest meat companies in Brazil. And because of those relationships and working with those massive meat corporations on transition rather than disruption, we're also able to have excellent relationships with both the Science and Technology Department in Brazil, as well as Embrapa, which is basically the Agricultural Research Service of Brazil. And it's all about jobs, and it's all about protecting Brazil's role as the world's meat supplier. In India, we're talking about science, economics, jobs, and nutrition. As people, I'm sure, are aware here, undernutrition, stunting, wasting, and malnutrition are huge issues in India. India produces some crazy percentage of the world's vaccines. And we have recently signed an MOU with the state of Maharashtra, which is where Mumbai is in India, and we're working very closely with the Modi government. And we have 22 institutes of technology and other research institutions in India focused on alternative proteins. And it's because India is excited about the economics and the jobs. They want to become an exporter. They also have world-class scientific institutions, and they have nutrition issues that can be solved through alternative proteins. I had one more, but apparently not. Lesson 3, find insiders to serve as champions and guides. This is, well, they're all super important, but this is one of the ones that, at least for me, was a little bit less intuitively obvious. So I mentioned that GFI, the plurality of GFI's team members are scientists, but GFI's budget line item that is the biggest is probably policy, because we hire lobbyists. So we've hired Van Scoyoc, we've hired to do our on the Hill lobbying, we've hired the Russell Group to do our executive lobbying. We work with climate advisors very, very closely. They are under contract with ClimateWorks Foundation to do the work that we're doing with them. And then Data for Progress, which does a lot of EA work. And then they are very enthusiastic about alternative proteins, so have given us a fair amount of pro bono work, which we're extraordinarily grateful for. And having the people who full-time all the time are doing this work is just absolutely invaluable to figuring out how Capitol Hill works and figuring out how executive agencies work. At the state level, we almost always hire lobbyists when we are doing state work. We got $5 million for alternative proteins from the state of California. GFI was the only NGO working on that, but we did hire lobbyists. It would not have happened without our lobbyists. Similarly, we got a label censorship bill killed in Virginia. They wanted to ban the use of milk and meat labeling on nutritional labels. We hired a very high-power law firm, and the people on the GFI staff were just blown away by just the doors that this opened. And out of more than 1,000 bills, I'm trying to pull the number off here, but out of more than 1,000 bills, this was the one bill that the governor of Virginia ended up vetoing. That would not have happened if we had not hired a lobbyist. And then working with legislative champions. So Ash Kalra in the state of California, Rosa DeLauro at the national level have been completely and totally instrumental, both in the $5 million that I just mentioned, and then Rosa DeLauro got alternative protein R&D defined as climate science in the 2022 appropriations bill. She got alternative protein R&D added explicitly to the Institute of IFRI, Institute of Food and Agricultural Research budget, which is a $450 million budget, and multiple other things. She also got us a precise earmark for $5 million, and really would not have happened without Ash Kalra as a champion in California and Rosa DeLauro as a champion in the US Congress. I already mentioned our relationships with JBS, Marfrig, and BRF, but this is what that relationship has done. The Brazil Ministry of Science has been working closely with GFI for 3 years. Based on this, we're inserting alternative proteins into public policies in the government of Brazil. And as you know, this is the Bolsonaro government of Brazil, which does not believe in climate change, but does believe in agricultural productivity and wants to keep Brazil at the forefront. This is a photo from last week. It is a celebration of the Jewish New Year, and the keynote address was delivered by GFI's managing director. And it was all plant-based meat at this celebration of Jewish New Year that was the Israeli Institute of Trade that held this party. One of the craziest parties I've been to was in June. Israel celebrated their 74th Independence Day. They had a party at the United Nations, and the 3 speakers were the UN ambassador to Israel, President Herzog, and GFI's managing director for Israel. So Israel is leaning in a big way in alternative proteins, and that is all due to the relationship that we have cultivated with the Israel Innovation Authority. Lesson number 4, be nonpartisan. I already talked about this, but lean into what you need to lean into and have the conversations that you need to have. Obviously, never say anything that's not true. Obviously, never say one thing to one person that you would be disconcerted if they repeated to somebody else. But if you are with Republicans and you know that they are not particularly interested in climate change, perfectly acceptable to lean into economic value. In Minnesota, this is working for us. We have legislation that we introduced in Minnesota to fund alternative protein research in the state of Minnesota, bipartisan legislation. We also have multiple Republicans signed on to the Protein Innovation Caucus that GFI will be launching with a C4 that we partner with very closely called Food Solutions Action. Reason Magazine is like the intellectual hub of libertarianism. And they are all in on the idea of free markets, anti-cronyism, all of the sort of protectionist stuff that we want to make sure doesn't happen from industrial animal agriculture. The libertarian wing of the Republican Party is 100% in agreement. Lesson 5, I'm going to blow through the remaining lessons, but just to say lesson 5, I already nodded at the fact that GFI works very closely with ADM, with Nestle, with the 5 largest meat companies in the world. And I think this one is probably one of the things that was most counterintuitive for me as somebody who worked at Farm Sanctuary and PETA previously. And now I am literally introduced as a friend of Tyson to Boston Consulting Group, and am quoted in press releases from JBS, which is the largest meat company in the world. But JBS credits GFI with helping them make the decision to invest $100 million in cultivated meat, and also helping them with product development on their plant-based line. This is just more about what it means to get the really big food and meat companies on board with alternative proteins. It will just happen way faster. They have consumer loyalty, they have supply chains, they have R&D budgets, they have the shelf space. So working with industry may be a little counterintuitive, especially for people who care about animals, but so critically important. Drawing inspiration and copying ideas from parallel sectors. This is also, this is what it looks like to implement our global battle cry that government should be funding alternative proteins. So again, funding open access science, incentivizing private sector. We are super similar to other tech-based innovation that starts with government and then moves to the private sector. So we've got government support and regulatory buy-in as absolutely critical. Large established incumbents can be resistant to change, and we want to do what we can to make that not happen. Huge upfront R&D costs. Probably people in this room who are paying attention know about these upfront costs for cultivated meat. They're not radically different for plant-based meat. Huge CapEx costs, low margin commodity products, specialized talent and labor needs, and massively scaled industrial sector is what we're going for by 2050. So looking at what has worked, especially in terms of finance, and infrastructure and R&D incentives is going to be absolutely critical, and that's what we're doing. Oh, I mentioned this earlier. This is the American National Competitiveness and the Future of Meat paper, in which Sonny Perdue is on the cover and kind of throughout the thing. There's also a lot of reference to China, because both Democrats and Republicans want to out-innovate China. So we lean into that and point out that President Xi has been talking about alternative proteins in China's 5-year bioeconomy plan and China's 5-year ag plan, both flag alternative proteins. And then I think, yes, it even says conclusion, look at that. And lesson number 7, complex challenges require a learning mindset. Obviously, just everything in EA is about challenging our preconceptions and bringing a learning mindset. So I think I won't dive into examples, but just to say, I started working on GFI 7 years ago next week, and so much has changed in how we think about and the preconceptions that we brought into thinking about how we do outreach to scientists, how we influence governments, and what it looks like to influence the for-profit sector. And just bringing a lot of humility and asking a lot of questions and having tons and tons of conversations with people who have been doing this sort of work in parallel sectors for so much longer is absolutely invaluable. The last thing I want to say, since this is a policy-focused EA conference, is that GFI will soon be hiring both a federal legislative specialist, which is just a lobbyist, and also a legislative director, so somebody to oversee our US lobbying work, and also an executive assistant, in all 3 cases working out of our DC policy office. If you would like to keep up with alternative proteins or keep up with GFI, I think we have like 5 maybe newsletters, including our monthly reports, so monthly highlights, so you can keep up with what GFI is doing. You can sign up at gfi.org/newsletters. And I am absolutely convinced that we can eliminate industrial animal agriculture in the same way that we are going to eliminate the need for combustion engines and eliminate fossil fuels. And we're going to do it by bringing a learning mindset. And these are some of the lessons. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Thanks, Eric.
Luckily for all of you, we are not just going to talk about whatever I have written on this iPad here. You guys are going to help me out. So if you can go to Swapcard on your cell phone and pull up the appointment or the event for today's talk, you'll see a live discussion button that you can click. Feel free to submit questions there on the questions tab. You can also just upvote questions that other people have put, and I'll try to sort of roughly go in order of interest. Of course, make sure those cell phones are also on silent. But we've got about 20 minutes and change to continue the discussion. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Delighted.
So I actually am curious to sort of start towards the end when you mentioned that this learning mindset is so important. And I would love if you could go over just some of the biggest lessons that you've learned, maybe some mistakes that GFI has made in the course of this 7-year-plus journey, things that you might do differently nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so one of the most important things that GFI is doing right now, and I think the most important thing that we're doing on the corporate engagement side, is our work with the really big food and meat companies. When I started working on GFI 7 years ago, I really just had no idea what it would become. But by the time, and I spent the first 5 or 6 months just having conversations with people, we started hiring people in June of 2016. So it took sort of that long to figure out what the theory of change was going to be. But by the time we were hiring people in June of 2016, there was absolutely no sense that we had a shot in hell at convincing the big meat and food companies that this could be the future. that was just a massive oversight. Like, now we have these conversations with JBS, Tyson, Cargill, ADM, Nestle, and our essential message is, don't be Kodak, be Canon. It is incredibly inefficient to grow crops to feed them to animals so that we can eat animals. It's a 12,000-year-old technology, and that concept can resonate with anybody. So these companies, they really are protein companies. They're not, like, none of these executives are excited about the idea of slaughtering animals. None of them are excited about the undercover investigations or being attacked by, climate activists or rainforest activists or whatever. So if we have the courage of our convictions around the business opportunities here, the idea that we would write off the people who are most able to execute and make this happen as quickly as possible, I think is a remarkable oversight. We have similar oversight, similar sort of big mistakes and oversights on the how we were approaching scientists, and also what our focus was in terms of policy. But I think that one is probably the biggest.
I mean, it's an understandable oversight. I don't think anybody, 7 years ago would think that Tyson would be super approachable by somebody who's coming out of, whose goal is to end animal agriculture. So it's
maybe. I mean, intuitively, it feels kind of obvious now. But I mean, I think I just had so many preconceptions about those companies based on what I was working on previously. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think your ability to talk to them is a testament to sort of walking this fine tightrope of messaging. And you did a great job of highlighting how different countries, different companies, different sides of the aisle all require different points of emphasis. One thing that seems somewhat absent in general is animal welfare. I know a lot of people in EA are interested in this cause because they're specifically thinking about reducing suffering. Can you talk a little bit about why it is that GFI focuses more on the economic and climate side of things? Is that something that you guys have tested or just sort of know from other experience that that's not the way to go?
Well, GFI's, our battle cry, as I mentioned, is that governments should be funding open access science, and government should be incentivizing private sector R&D and private sector manufacturing and infrastructure build out. And I mentioned the Climate Works Foundation and the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office report from last November, and they end up saying governments need to put $10.1 billion into this, 4.4 and 5.7, and it can become this massive industry with these colossal climate benefits. When we are meeting with legislators, when we're meeting with the Department of State, when we're meeting with other governments, they are used to putting vast sums of money, like 10.1 is pretty small by comparison to what governments are used to spending on global health and climate initiatives. But it is $10.1 billion more, which is to say, they're not going to spend a dime on something that helps farm animals. The most we can expect, and even this is a pretty steep climb, is that they will make illegal the most egregiously abusive practices. They mostly won't even do that. But they're not going to fund a shift to alternative proteins to protect animals. But they are starting to, and we think more and more will, fund the shift for climate benefits and global health benefits.
Nice.
So it's not, we're not consumer focused. I think a consumer focus probably would continue to focus on animals, but a policy focus is where policymakers are used to spending money.
That makes sense. Yeah. So I guess on this topic of sort of trying to thread that needle, figure out what the best angle is to talk to different constituencies, a question from the audience from Angelina. Do you have any advice on how you would brand other EA causes as more legible or less weird to policy collaborators? Obviously, GFI has been very impressive with the way that all proteins have been discussed in government. And are there lessons that AI safety or wild animal welfare can learn from what you guys have accomplished?
Yeah, I mean, when I was working with Zach Weston from GFI on sort of these specific lessons, we were trying to make the lessons cross-applicable to other areas. We weren't thinking, I mean, we did, I thought a little bit about some of the specific areas, but I guess it's going to be pretty different depending on which of the things that you're thinking about. I feel like Will McCaskill has been doing a pretty good job on really an excellent job on all of his recent interviews, framing long-termism as sort of, not super long-termism, but sort of shorter long-termism in ways that I think can really resonate with people. And I think, I guess one, the test our hypotheses, one of the conversations that I'm having over and over and over with people who have been working in climate for decades is bringing the sort of Socratic method. And so I was with the Bezos Earth Fund all day yesterday doing scoping around, and a bunch of other, they had, I think, like 20 people around the table. And one of the conversations I had with multiple people who have been in climate for a really long time is saying, our hypothesis is that alternative proteins is the only way industrial meat production does not go up 60% by 2050 or more. The scientific consensus is that if that happens, Paris goals are impossible. Do you agree with that? What are we missing in that as an observation? And then sort of having conversations with people who we want to influence in a way that's not just turning them into a passive receptacle for our argument, but is instead like getting their systems to really thinking about what our argument is, and basically helping us sort of make the strongest argument possible, which also sort of helps to entrench what it is that we're thinking in their brains as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Inviting people in, I think, is a widely cross-applicable technique. We have a question from James, who's wondering, what have you changed your mind on regarding the technical timeline until alternative protein since you started GFI 7 years ago?
I have radically updated my thinking on the technical timeline on alternative proteins, even just in the last couple of years. So I think it's less than 2 years ago that GFI put out a techno-economic analysis on cultivated meat. And we worked with 15 companies, as well as the Agency for Science, Technology, and Research, which is Singapore's National Science Foundation, essentially, all working under NDA with the company that we contracted. And it was super helpful and frustrating. And I will say we didn't put our thumb on the scale in any way. Like, we did not know what was going to come back, and we were perfectly willing to have them come back and go, this is not possible. And what they came back with was pretty optimistic. I think at that point I had been influenced to think that alternative proteins was going to take longer, that cultivated meat was going to take longer and cost more. So like by 2030, according to that techno-economic analysis, we can get to expensive but not crazy expensive cultivated meat with basically some government guaranteed loans. So probably most people in this room know that government guaranteed loans saved Tesla from bankruptcy at least a couple times. Elon Musk says they were going to be bankrupt like a month later if they hadn't gotten this DOE loan at one point. So I think I went from this is fairly easy to this may be, this is more likely than not impossible, to this is possible, but it's still going to be really hard and require government support sort of over time, and that's still where I am. On plant-based meat, when I started GFI, GFI, when we started, the idea was to create more impossible foods and beyond meat. Like, that's what the goal was. And now we're 13 years after Beyond Meat was founded, 11 years after Impossible Foods was founded. We still don't have anything that's really even close to where we need to be in terms of taste the same or better and cost the same or less. And GFI did sort of a mini techno-economic analysis on the plant-based side and said, what would it look like to get to 6% plant-based meat by 2030? And there's literally not enough coconut oil in the world to get there. Like, the number of factories that are going to be needed to get to 6% is pretty substantial. And the supply chains that are going to need to be created. So on the cultivated meat side, like, we just absolutely need a synthetic albumin or a replacement for albumin. on the cultivated meat side, as well as like nobody's ever scaled up cell multiplication to even, I think, like 10,000 liter bioreactors, let alone 200,000 liter bioreactors. So it's going to be challenging, but I've become a lot more optimistic since our techno-economic analysis on the cultivated meat side. Seeing that production volume modeling report on plant-based meat made me realize how critically important it is to get governments and sort of the NGO climate and global health communities on board, because it's going to be maybe as hard as cultivated meat. It's certainly going to be hard. And it's not an app. It's like food, and it has ingredients, and those ingredients have to taste good, and so far they don't taste good enough, and they cost too much. So what it looks like to get there, I think, is going to be challenging. We're working on a techno-economic analysis on the plant-based side, so it'll be sort of a deeper dive version of our production volume modeling report. I'm excited to see what comes back.
What are the error bars in those kind of analyses? Does it feel like it's a pretty robust methodology, or are you sort of getting really, really broad insights, but not able to?
It feels, within the context of the fact that cultivated meat, there's only one company that's raised, what is Upside Food raised? I think they've raised maybe like $600 million, which is, again, when I was with the Bezos Earth Fund people, and one of the questions was, hasn't there been enough private investment in alternative proteins? Do we really need government support for this? And on the one hand, there have been like $8 billion in VC investment. On the other hand, that is less than the cost of 2 gigafactories for lithium-ion battery production. So it really is basically nothing, relatively speaking. So in the context of the fact that all of these companies are insanely young, and so consequently there's probably more that we don't know, even that we don't know, than that we do know. But I will say it's the first techno-economic analysis that involved actual industry results. It's the first techno-economic analysis that involved an entire scientific department of a government. So the Ministry of Science for Singapore put their best tissue engineers into it. So I'm pretty I'm optimistic about the robustness of our TEA more so than any other TEA. But it's never like both things have never been done. We've never created cultivated meat at reasonable price points. We've also never created plant-based meat that satisfies meat eaters at reasonable price points. But I will say, when I think about the analogy to renewable energy and electric vehicles, it feels more tractable than either of them. So for electric vehicles, you need cobalt. Most of that comes from slave labor in the Congo. You need lithium. Most of that comes from weaker areas of China. You need nickel. Most of that's coming from Ukraine. So like the ingredients and the infrastructure required for EVs, which even with 100% adoption are going to be well less than half as valuable as a shift to alternative proteins, it feels a lot harder. And then similarly, I made the point about renewable energy. It takes 10 times the land per unit of energy, whereas we require a 20th of the land if you're talking about beef, and a 4th the land if you're talking about chicken. So the jury is out on whether EVs will be wildly successful and whether renewable energy can dominate. The jury is out on alternative proteins, but it feels like a safer bet, or as safe a bet as anything else that the climate community is working on.
Sure. I want to actually zero in on the terminology there. Alternative proteins, you mentioned. Cultivated meat, obviously, is a word that's come up many times here. Cameron is wondering that it seems like GFI has put a lot of thought and effort into which terms to use to describe meat from cells. Cell-based meat, clean meat, cultivated meat, these are all different options. In retrospect, how important do you think those word choices were to the growth of the industry? And do you think that other causes should put a similar amount of effort into messaging, or sort of let terms arise more organically?
Yeah, I will say that that's another example of sort of a colossal, and I don't know if it's an error, but if I could go back in time, I certainly would have abandoned any of the effort that we put into calling it clean meat. And we put a lot of effort into calling it clean meat and getting people on board. And that was because we didn't think we had a shot at getting Tyson and Cargill and ADM to be supportive. So sort of as we became sort of realized that we could get them on board, The implication of calling it clean meat is that what they're doing is dirty meat, and shocker, they didn't like that. Yeah, I mean, if I could go, I'm really happy with where we landed on Cultivated, and the conversations that I had with people like Uma Valetti at Upside Foods and Josh Tetrick at Eat Just and others. Like, they think Cultivated and it's cultivation, like supernatural, not supernatural, but like very natural. So I think cultivated meat is the right place to land. I will say, when we decided clean meat was like the wrong way to go, I thought we should just go back to cultured. And people on our communications team, working with Mattson, which is a marketing firm in Minneapolis, like pretty aggressively, Barb Stuckey, who's the president of Mattson in particular, were really aggressive that cultured creates a sense of like science-y, and people don't want science in their food. So for me, I just was like, so like battle scarred from the clean meat versus cultured conversations, and I just wanted it to stop. It does seem like Cultivated, and again, I'll say that our European team worked with a marketing firm to figure out what are the words we're going to use across the European countries. And it came down as Cultivated pretty consistently, with no thumb on the scales. Something similar is happening in Asia, and Cultivated is clearly the direction that they're going. So it feels important, but probably not like crazy dispositively important to me, although I'll say my confidence level on that is really low. But I definitely would have never gone down the clean meat. If I could do that over again, I would.
Well, you guys have ended up in a pretty good place, I'd say. So good, in fact, that many people in the audience might be interested in supporting GFI with donations. James is asking, what do additional donations to GFI do today? Where are you guys currently bottlenecked, and where resources still needed?
Thanks, James. So GFI spends in 1 year what we raised in the previous year. So like, we have our funding for 2022 right now, and we are raising for 2023. So it is quite literally the case that money that comes in 2022 will allow us to do more in 2023, because that's how we're going to budget. We are leaning into Asia and Europe expansion next year. So we're not probably going to expand India, Israel, or Brazil much at all. There is some hiring in the US that is like super high impact and critically important in terms of expanding some of our science and policy work. But where we really need to grow, we need to open up in Korea and Japan. Korea and Japan have been critically important in global drug development. Japan was dispositively important in bringing solar costs down. So when GFI figures out what countries we're going to operate in, our only two questions are, do they have world-class scientific institutions, and do they have governments that fund science? So if you're wondering why we are in the countries we're in, those are the only two variables that are determinative. And when we think about areas of the world where the answer is yes, they have world-class scientific institutions and governments that fund a ton of science, there are multiple countries in Europe where we should be lobbying and building scientific ecosystems, and then Japan and Korea are the other two countries. So we are trying to raise $30 million by the end of the year, which will allow us to implement our battle plans. So, I mean, depending on the size of the donation, it's basically, will we be able to hire lobbyists? Will we be able to hire think tanks and EY consultants and others to help us figure out what our policy battle plan is going to be, as we have done to just huge success in the countries that we operate in now? Will we be able to hire policy team staff? So it really is sort of a one-to-one relationship in terms of the impact we'll be able to have on the science and policy sides as we expand in Europe and Japan. I mean, Europe and Asia. Nice.
Well, yeah, hopefully that list of countries continues to grow. Actually, a quick follow-up from Daniela. Does GFI do any work in Canada?
We do limited work in Canada. We're pretty responsive rather than sort of overtly directive in Canada. So we do some science work in Canada. We do some policy work in Canada, but not substantial.
Nice. All right, we are coming up on time. I think Bruce has a little bit of wiggle room after this session, so maybe we'll go a little bit over, but if anyone needs to run, just so you know, it is now 3 o'clock on the dot. A couple more questions from the audience. Zooming out a bit from the specifics of cultivated meat and alternative protein, what have you found most challenging in your role as a CEO in general?
I suck at saying no. I mean, I guess two things. One is I am really enthusiastic about kind of everything. And if somebody comes to me and they're enthusiastic about something, I will also be enthusiastic about it. And I can't say yes to everything. I also just like if somebody is enthusiastic about something and I'm not enthusiastic about it, I still hate saying no because they could be right. I mean, the woman who designed we have an alternative protein project, which is our university chapter system, and a woman named Amy Huang put it together. And I remember her boss and I at the time, David Welch, who now is CTO for a VC called Synthesis Capital, and she brought her battle plan to us, and we both thought, this will never work. But we did approve it because she's just incredible and insanely persuasive, and it has been so much more wildly successful than either of us thought. We have been proved so colossally wrong from fairly quickly after she launched the program. So I think saying no to things I find really difficult. I'm also not a very organized person. And for the first probably 3 or 4 years of GFI, everybody who came to work at GFI, one of the conversations I had with them was, we are building the plane while we are flying the plane, which is a really apt metaphor. And I would say, so the wings are falling off and we're just grabbing duct tape and duct taping the wings back on. And that works okay until you have 30 or 35 people. But we have 170 people now, including about half in the US and half overseas. So I've hired fantastically organized people, but just like I am thoroughly outclassed by the people who we have, in our VP roles, I also am bad at systems, but we have lots of systems at GFI, and obviously I should be sort of setting the example, and I just kind of suck at it, which is a little humiliating.
Well, I clearly think that there's been quite a bit of success regardless, so you must be doing something right there.
Thank you.
All right, maybe time for one last question. Michael is wondering, do you think that there is a need for bad cops in this space as well? In particular, should there be organizations out there that are trying to tax animal production or otherwise regulate it in environmental ways that maybe libertarians from Reason magazine, for example, would oppose?
I mean, this is, I hear from people pretty regularly who are incensed about agricultural subsidies, and this is just such a quintessentially EA analysis. Ronald Reagan opposed agricultural subsidies. Both George Bushes opposed agricultural subsidies. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden opposed agricultural subsidies. Unclear what Trump thought about agricultural subsidies, but other than Trump, every president since Ronald Reagan has found agricultural subsidies to be something that, just they're opposed from sort of different ideological advantages. So unless we think we have a shot at doing something that every president since Reagan was unable to do, it's, just the tractability of these sorts of things strikes me as vanishingly low. We're not going to tax meat. I mean, we can't even, something like eliminating dual-use subtherapeutic antibiotics. Back when Louise Slaughter was in the House of Representatives, every 2 years she would propose a ban. American Heart Association, like every major health and environmental organization was behind this ban on dual use, so medically relevant drugs, essentially drugs that are used in farm animals that are important to human medicine. Never got anywhere. I mean, it got an awful lot of co-sponsors, but like the Ag Department, the Ag committees, House and Senate, they're not letting it out of committee. So I think the art of the possible would counsel against, windmill tilting, personally.
Nice. Well, what you guys have been doing is clearly not only pragmatic, but really impactful. So thank you so much for the good work you're doing. And
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you for speaking with us today. Please join me one more time in giving a hand to Bruce.